listen as the traditional belief in Moshiach is demystified and presented in a down-to-earth fashion. This timely discussion of a misunderstood subject helps us to analyze the conditions of the world necessary for the coming of Moshiach. Firstly, the undeniable leadership crisis across the globe, and secondly, the realization of the prophecy that before Moshiach, children will be more observant than their parents. This tape emphasizes the need to actively prepare for Moshiach by making the world more godly, and this leads us into a discussion on the subject of prayer in public schools.
A few years ago, the subject of Moshiach being discussed in public, and particularly among Jews, was unheard of. It was considered at best an irrelevant subject, and at worst, some kind of old-fashioned, superstitious, archaic belief that had no place in modern times. As a result, an entire generation of Jews grew up knowing practically nothing about Moshiach. For most of the Jewish population in America, Moshiach came to be a non-Jewish subject. Christians spoke of Moshiach, but Jews? It's not Jewish. This young man who began studying Christianity with some cult, when they asked him why he doesn't look into Judaism, why he looks into other people's religions and not his own, he said, because Judaism doesn't have what Christianity has. And they said, for example, he said, well, all those good books like Isaiah and Jeremiah. He was shocked to find out that Isaiah, Jeremiah were Jews and that this is part of Torah. Because who do you hear about Isaiah from? Not your grandfather. And Moshiach certainly was not a Jewish subject. But recently, Moshiach has become not only an acceptable topic for conversation, but a necessary article of faith for Jews across the board, regardless of background or education. Curious thing happened a few years ago. You know, there's a statement attributed to the Alter Rebbe, made some 200 years ago, that when Moshiach comes, we will know about it, not through miraculous means, but we'll read about it in the morning papers. You'll get up in the morning, and the paper will say, Moshiach has arrived. So anyway, it was a few years ago, and on the news, the announcer, the newscaster says, and the Moshiach, the Messiah, is coming. More after this. And he goes to a commercial. And after the commercial, he comes back and he says that there's a report out of Israel that three great rabbis, had simultaneous dreams in which they dreamt that Moshiach was coming within 120 days, or at the end of 120 days. And this was on the news. I later heard from people in England and in South Africa that it was on the news there too, around the same time. And at that time, around that time, a group of the graduating class of the Lutheran seminary had come to Lubavitch House for a lecture, and the teacher there, the minister at the seminary, calls me at Lubavitch House, and he says, can you tell me any more? Now, I hadn't heard this news item, and I didn't know what he was referring to. He says, can you tell me any more? And I said, about what? And he says, oh, haven't you heard the news? I said, no. So he tells me about it. And he says, well, do you know anything more about it? I said, no, but if I hear anything... But it was interesting that he would call Lubavitch House. So the next day on the news, they retracted the story. They said that they had checked with the rabbis, and they had all denied it. Seems like one rabbi said that the story couldn't possibly be true because he never tells his dreams. So even if he had had a dream, he would never have told it to anyone. And the second rabbi said it wasn't true because he never dreams. And the third rabbi said it wasn't true because he never sleeps. So the whole story was dismissed, and on the news they retracted it, and people were disappointed. But actually, the fact that Moshiach was on prime time news is in itself a very significant thing. You consider the fact that Moshiach made it to national news and nobody had even dreamt about it. The dreams weren't even true. So how is it that Moshiach was suddenly a subject for prime time news? Well, around that time, Moshiach had become pretty much of a mania all over the world. Everybody had Moshiach on their mind. As a matter of fact, on the negative side, people who wanted to start movements or become famous or capitalize on other people's weaknesses proclaimed themselves Moshiach. In previous years, people proclaimed themselves prophets, preachers, teachers, but now it started with Moshiach. You start at the level of claiming to be Moshiach. Others went on to say that they were God, but the minimum, in order to attract the following, you had to say you were at least Moshiach. Prophets didn't go over big anymore. It wasn't impressive or attractive. You had to be at least Moshiach. So you have this guy from Korea running around saying that he's Moshiach, and you have this guy from Guyana, Jonestown, running around saying that he is Moshiach. Moshiach has become a very popular subject. Among Jews, we had to do a little double time. We had to catch up on a lot of wasted years, because all of a sudden the world was talking about Moshiach, and we didn't know what to say. So we had to do a little catching up. What exactly is Moshiach? What do we believe? What is factual? What is literal? What is not? Because the coming of Moshiach and the details concerning the coming of Moshiach are, for necessary and obvious reasons, in Torah obscure. The Torah mentions Moshiach 2,000, 3,000 years ago, but obviously wouldn't tell you when Moshiach is coming, because then the people who are 1,000 years away from his coming would have nothing to look forward to, would have nothing to hope for. And so the Torah purposely presents Moshiach in obscure terms, in riddles and in secrets, in metaphors, and we don't know in many of those cases what that metaphor means, what the riddle is supposed to tell us, until it actually happens. On the other hand, believing in Moshiach is one of the 13 principles of faith on which Judaism is built, and therefore it must have its practical application as every other mitzvah has. We may not know the full significance and mystical effects of a mitzvah, like tefillin, for example, and we won't know until Moshiach comes exactly how great the mitzvah is and what its full significance is. But at the same time, we do know very clearly, very literally, exactly how the mitzvah is to be performed. How, by whom, when, with what. And the same has to be true with Moshiach. There's a commandment to believe in the coming of Moshiach, so we have to know exactly what it is that we're supposed to believe. We can't have a vague belief, just as you can't have a vague mitzvah. There are two possibilities with Moshiach. Based on the scripture, the Gemara says that Moshiach has a deadline. There is a time when Moshiach must come. But that God also promises, I will hasten him before his time. That God will bring Moshiach will come before the deadline. So the Gemara says, if we deserve, then Moshiach will come before the time. If we don't deserve, then he'll come on time. Otherwise, what sense does it make to have a deadline, but not come by the deadline? If he's going to come sooner, why set a deadline? So both of them have their reality. The deadline is when Moshiach will come if we don't deserve. The hastening of Moshiach will happen if we do deserve. Another thing is that the manner in which Moshiach will arrive can also be in one of two ways. Either he will come through miracles, and it will happen instantaneously, painlessly, and that is if we deserve, or if we don't deserve, Moshiach will come anyway, but he will come through the slow, normal, natural process without the miracles. And that's why you have these two statements in the prophets. One statement says that he will come floating on a cloud. Mashiach will float in on a cloud miraculously. And the other statement is that he will come riding on a donkey. And these are two extremes. Floating on the cloud is an instantaneous, miraculous thing. Coming on a donkey is a slow, torturous process. How can both be possible? Coming on the cloud in a miraculous fashion is if we do deserve. Coming on a donkey in the slow, natural means is if we don't deserve. In later generations, there were discussions between rebbes, between different rabbis in Europe, as to how Moshiach will come. And one of them said with a great sigh, with a krechts, he said, I'm afraid Moshiach is going to come naturally without miracles. The Alter Rebbe, quoted before, said not with a sigh, not unhappily. He said matter-of-factly, when Moshiach comes, it'll be in the papers. Which means that yes, he will come through natural means, he will come normally, but that's not a negative thing. It's not a sad thing. That's the way it ought to be. Moshiach ought to come through natural means. When we talk about deserving or not deserving Moshiach, we're not necessarily talking about being good or bad, because how good do we have to be for Moshiach? And no matter how bad we are, we're not so bad that Moshiach shouldn't come. We don't deserve to be in exile any longer. So the question of deserving or not deserving has to be understood properly. The exact literal translation of the Hebrew word, the Hebrew term used, is zakai, or chayev. And that doesn't really mean deserving or undeserving. Zakai means pure, purified. If we're pure, then Mashiach will come one way. If we're not pure, we're not zakai, then he'll come another way. And that's not a threat. That's merely an appropriate manner to the condition that we're in. If we are purified, then we will appreciate Mashiach one way. If we're not purified, then coming from that condition, we will appreciate him in another way. So that the Rebbe seems to maintain that both things, or both ways, can be true at the same time. We can be zakai and not zakai at the same time. And Mashiach can come before his time and yet in his time at the same time. And that's why the Rebbe says that if Mashiach would come today, it wouldn't be before his time, and yet it would be hastened. So that within the time in which Mashiach has to come, there can be a hastening or a delaying of Mashiach's coming. So we actually are now in a position, in terms of history, and in terms of the condition that we're in, that we can expect Mashiach on both counts. We can expect Mashiach because it's time. We can expect Mashiach because God will hasten his coming. Now, what does it mean to be pure, to be worthy of the coming of Mashiach? There's a certain amount of godliness that we're supposed to produce in the world. Every mitzvah produces a certain amount of godliness. This godliness accumulates over all of history. So unlike unholy things that we do, the sins that we commit, which introduce ungodliness into the world, this unholiness is temporary. When a person sinned, regrets his sin, then the unholiness is removed and is undone. A person committed his sin and then dies, the sin dies with him. A sin is not eternal, and even if the sin lingers after death, it gets erased or cleansed in the process of dying, or after death in the process of the purification of the soul. So within a year, in almost all cases, all the sins and all the unholiness produced by a given person after he dies are erased. So that sinfulness, unholiness, is a temporary thing and is constantly diminishing. Whereas mitzvahs and godliness are permanent, they're eternal, and therefore are accumulative. So that the little bit of godliness that we add to the world, we're adding to the 5,000 years of godliness that has accumulated since the beginning of creation. So to be worthy means that the world will have absorbed enough godliness to make the world capable of accepting Mashiach. Let's try less mystical terms. When mankind will come to a position where we've learned enough from our history, when we've become wise enough because of the accumulated experiences of mankind to realize that we need Moshiach, then Mashiach can come. Then we're ready. If there's ever been a time when mankind agreed on a need for Mashiach, it's probably in these last few years. It's mystical, otherworldly, for a person in the times of, say, Caesar to believe in Mashiach, unless they believe that he was Mashiach. It took a great leap of faith for people in the times of Napoleon to believe in Mashiach. And it was a great act of faith on the part of our grandparents, or our great-grandparents in days of Stalin, in days of Churchill, de Gaulle, to believe in Moshiach. Because to believe in Moshiach means that you believe that there will be one man who will have the ear, the cooperation, and the obedience of all mankind. He will be Jewish. And to think that someone can come along and instruct the whole world and tell everybody what to do, and Stalin will listen, de Gaulle will listen, Churchill will listen, it was not humanly believable. Only through great faith could they believe it. But today, we don't need that great leap of faith. Almost any person you ask from any country will readily admit that there is a desperate, real, and immediate need for leadership, for a leader. Nobody, not even in Russia, believes that the president or the dictator or the king or the prime minister of their country has the answer to the world's problems. As a matter of fact, most people believe that their dictator or king or president is part of the problem, not part of the solution. So the one thing that we have today that is pretty much unprecedented in history is that the whole world agrees that we're suffering from a leadership crisis. So if we're talking about being ready for Mashiach, in terms of having learned the lesson, the one big lesson that we have learned is that looking back over history, we now realize that a powerful leader does not solve problems. That some guy who can wield a powerful army and subdue other nations and conquer other countries doesn't solve mankind's problems. Part of the reason that we see things that way, that clearly, is because the world has become such a small place. It's because we now think in terms of mankind. We don't think in terms of one country's problem. Because we now know that the way one country goes, the whole world goes. We're no longer that isolated that we can have, God forbid, a nuclear war down the street, but it won't affect us. The world has become one battlefield. So if there's a problem, it's a problem not just for a country, but for mankind. And in terms of solving mankind's problems, we don't see and we can't believe that anybody in power today has any kind of solution. Another thing is that part of the prophecy, the predictions concerning the times before Mashiach, the setting prior to the coming of Mashiach, is that the nations of the world, or the kings and nations of the world, will be at odds with each other. There'll be animosity between countries. And although there's always been war, but in all past times, we could locate the war. We could pinpoint it and say, there's a conflict going on between these two countries or those two countries. Sometimes it involved 3 countries, 4 countries. But you could always identify it. You could always point on the map and say, this is where the war is going on. These are the good guys, these are the bad guys. This country is against this country, and so on. The conflict. Not necessarily on the battlefield, but the animosity and the distrust and the dislike and the threat that exists between countries today has become confusing and unidentifiable. Everybody is somehow antagonistic to everybody else in an unprecedented manner. And if you look at the hot spots, it's very clear that the conflict in the Middle East, for example, is not a local conflict. It's global. And in some way, in some very direct way, it affects every nation in the world. And no two nations agree on how it should be handled, or who the good guys are, who the bad guys are. It's a total state of conflict all over the world. Another sign that's supposed to be a symptom of the coming of Mashiach is a loss of authority. Interesting thing. If Mashiach is going to come along and the whole world is going to listen to him, everybody's going to obey him, you would think that when could a Mashiach come? When would the world be in a state of mind that some guy could come along and tell everybody what to do? You would think that this would happen when people are in a very obedient state of mind, when authority is very accepted, when everybody is accustomed to having a boss, to obeying commandments and so on. So some guy comes along and he gives the commandments, everybody will obey because they're in that frame of mind anyway. But the Gemara tells us that the exact opposite will happen. Moshiach will not come until people have completely forgotten what it means to obey. And the way the Gemara states it is that in the time before Mashiach comes, chutzpah will be rampant. The young will stand up against the old, against the elders. Daughters will rebel against their mothers, and daughters-in-law against their mothers-in-law, and so on. There's a positive side to this. How will we know that a given leader is truly Mashiach? We will know when in a time that people are accustomed to dismissing authority, to rebelling against authority, suddenly somebody comes along and this person is being obeyed, then something strange is going on. It won't be out of a need to obey. It will be out of a genuine need for leadership. And this expresses itself in a very unusual and totally unpredictable development. The final prophecy of the final prophet in the last book of the prophets is that before Mashiach comes, the children will bring their parents back to Judaism. If we put this in different words, you can see how ridiculous it sounds. Among other things, Judaism is a tradition. A tradition is passed on through the chain of tradition. Now, what sense does it make to say that children will transmit a tradition to their parents? It's a ridiculous statement. That can't happen. It's not human. You can't have children transmitting a tradition to their parents. Where did they get it from, if not from their parents? And if the parents didn't have it, where do the kids get it from? How can the children have it to give it to the parents? And yet that's what the prophecy says, that children will bring their parents around to Judaism. And without making a big tumult about it, and without grabbing front page headlines, it is actually happening today all over the world. Children are coming home saying, hey, why don't we keep this mitzvah? Why don't we do that? Why don't we keep kosher anymore? How come we don't go to shul? How come you didn't tell me about Judaism? And what is this thing about Moshiach that you never told me? Sometimes it happens in unfortunate, negative ways. Kid comes home and says, I'm now going to church. I'm religious now. And the mother says, what do you mean you're going to church? Well, you didn't teach me anything. And all of a sudden the family scrambles to get religious because they don't want to have to compete and lose their children to other religions. So the children are forcing, in this case, children are forcing parents to rethink Judaism and to go back to practicing Judaism. Children are coming back to their parents and saying, hey, you forgot something. You left an ingredient out in my diet, in my life. And that ingredient is God, religion, Bible, Judaism, Moshiach. Where did all that go? So the parents are coming around, becoming more observant in order to keep up with their children. There's a very interesting little incident. This little girl was going to this afternoon school, or Sunday school, and the Lubavitcher came to visit her class, speak to her class, and he mentioned that little girls should light candles, Shabbos candles. So this little girl felt that was really important, and she came home and asked her mother if they could light candles, Shabbos candles. But the mother wasn't interested and was not about to do it. So the girl says, but we have to do it. The rabbi said. And the mother said, no, we're not going to do that. So this little girl decides that she's going to surprise her mother. She was going to light the candle herself. So she goes down to the store, to the grocery store, whatever it was, and she says, I need a candle. She says, what kind of candle? She says, I don't know, a Jewish candle. She didn't know what to call Shabbos candles. A Jewish candle. So the guy in the store gave her a yahrzeit candle, a yahrzeit glass. Now, she didn't know the difference. She took it home, and before her mother came home from work Friday afternoon, she lights this yahrzeit candle, and she puts it on the dining room table. Her mother comes home and finds a yahrzeit candle burning on her table. She was horrified. She says to her daughter, what is this? And the daughter says, I lit it for you. You didn't have time to do it, so I lit it for you. Anyway, that somehow did something to the mother, And she decided from now on that it's going to be the right candle, not this candle. It's going to be a live candle, not a dead candle. So all over the world, literally, young people are schlepping their parents back to Yiddishkeit. So the signs, the symptoms of the coming of Moshiach, and the worthiness, the readiness for Moshiach seems to be very clear and unprecedented. These two things, a universal agreement that we are in need of leadership, probably never existed before, and for children to be more observant than their parents, also never existed before. And yet, these are the two predictions concerning the days before the coming of Moshiach. Now on to Moshiach himself. What exactly is Moshiach supposed to be? What exactly are we supposed to believe? Maimonides, the Rambam, is the only authority on Jewish law who codifies the laws concerning Moshiach. And although many future authorities, after the Rambam, wrote their own code of Jewish law, basing it primarily on the Rambam, but disagreeing here and there, coming to different conclusions on occasion. But when it comes to the laws of Moshiach, no later code of Jewish law disagrees with the Rambam concerning what he writes about Moshiach. Therefore, none of them write anything about Moshiach because they have nothing to add to what the Rambam already said. Which means that this is one of the few areas in Jewish law where there is no discussion, there is no disagreement. Unanimous agreement that these are in fact the laws of Moshiach. What is it that the Rambam says? We hear all sorts of midrashic predictions and descriptions of Moshiach. For example, the medrash that says that after the coming of Moshiach, the trees that today do not bear fruit will all begin to bear fruit. There won't be any fruitless tree. Every tree will bear fruit. Also, that food will no longer have to be processed. Food won't grow in a raw, unprepared state and then have to go through a process before it's edible. Everything will grow in its finished edible form. These miraculous developments, not to mention the resurrection of the dead, all of these developments, the Rambam says, are not connected with Moshiach. These are developments that will come after Moshiach. And that too is part of the belief, part of the one of the 13 principles of faith that Judaism teaches, that there will be a resurrection of the bodies of Jews when this world becomes perfect, and we have heaven on earth and so on. But that is a separate subject and a separate event from the coming of Moshiach, and that Moshiach is not expected to do any of these miraculous things. Moshiach isn't expected to change the laws of nature. The only thing Moshiach is supposed to accomplish is the change in human behavior. That whereas until now, through all of history, man in general has been predatory, warlike, jealous, greedy, and so on, all of that is going to disappear. People will learn to live together, to get along, to be nice. And that's what the prophet means when he says that the wolf will lie down with the lamb. The wolf is a reference to the predatory, warlike countries or nations who have been hostile to Jews. The lamb is a reference to the Jewish people. And when Mashiach comes, those animals that have been hateful and anti-Semitic will change, will lose their anger and their violence, and the wolf will lie down with the lamb. But that is the only change that Mashiach is expected to bring about. All the rest happens after Mashiach. So, what is Mashiach? The Rambam says the role of Mashiach is, politically speaking, bringing back and reestablishing the royal family of King David. That's basically what he is. Not to believe in Mashiach, the Rambam says, is to deny all of Torah, because Mashiach is mentioned in the prophecy of Bilam, which is in the Torah itself, and then of course in the prophets. References to Mashiach are numerous everywhere. One of the interesting things is that Moshe was commanded that when the Jews go into Israel for the first time, they would set up 3 cities of refuge. And then, at some time when the borders of Israel will be extended, there's a commandment that we are to set up 3 more cities of refuge. Now, the second set of 3 cities of refuge was never established, was never built. It's never happened yet. So here we have not only a mention of the coming of Moshiach, but an actual commandment concerning what to do when Moshiach comes. A commandment that has been waiting all these years to be fulfilled. It should not occur to you, the Rambam says, that Moshiach will have to perform miracles or change laws of nature or revive the dead or anything of that sort. It's not so. We know this not from speculation, but from actual precedent. There was a sage of sages, rabbi of rabbis, and teacher of teachers, Rabbi Akiva. And in his day, he believed that Bar Kokhba was Moshiach. His belief in him was so strong and so definite that he publicly announced that Bar Kokhba was Moshiach, and he personally volunteered to be Bar Kokhba's armor bearer. And all the sages of his generation deemed Bar Kokhba Moshiach until Bar Kokhba died. Then they knew that he was not Moshiach. So we have a precedent. We see how Rabbi Akiva believed in Moshiach. What do we learn from it? The Rambam says, if they felt that he was Moshiach and didn't know for sure until he either failed or succeeded, why couldn't they simply put him to a test? To say, look, let's find out if you're Moshiach or not. Do a miracle or something. Do something miraculous. But they never asked him to perform a miracle. The reason they never asked him to perform a miracle is because that wouldn't have proven anything. Moshiach does not have to do miracles, and therefore, if one does, some guy comes along and performs miracles, it doesn't prove anything. We also learn something else from Rabbi Akiva. The belief in Moshiach includes supporting a person alive in your generation who seems to have the makings of Moshiach. What are the makings of Moshiach? The Rambam says as follows. If there arises a leader among Jews who is a descendant of King David, from the house of David, and he is a diligent student of Torah, studies the written Torah as well as the oral Torah, and is devoted to mitzvahs, he is as pious as King David, and he brings Jews back to the observance of Torah, and he fights God's battles, which are not necessarily military battles. So if a person fits this description and seems to be accomplishing these things, then according to Jewish law, he is to be considered Moshiach. If after that, this person also builds the Beis HaMikdash, the temple, in its proper place in Yerushalayim, and gathers all Jews back to Israel, then this is Moshiach beyond a doubt. So what do we now know? We now know a very important thing. Moshiach is not someone who claims to be Moshiach. Moshiach will not come along and try to convince us that he is Moshiach. We are to notice these qualities in a Jew, in a leader of Jews. We will point to this person and say, this looks like Moshiach, and in all probability, the person will deny it. In genuine humility, Moshiach will deny that he is Moshiach. He won't know that he is Moshiach. But we will insist that he is Moshiach, because he has fulfilled the requirements, has met the descriptions, and Jewish law says this man is Moshiach, whether he wants to be or not. Which is very different from some guy campaigning with posters. If I am chosen Moshiach, I will so on, so on. And then, when Moshiach comes, he will fix the whole world, bring all mankind to serving God together, as it says in the prophet, because then I will give all the nations a clear language so that they can all call in the name of God and serve him together. This is the concluding paragraph of the Rambam. The sages and the prophets and all the pious Jews of history didn't look forward to the coming of Moshiach in order to rule the world, and not so that they could take revenge against their enemies, and also not to be able to eat, drink, and be merry. They looked forward, they pined for the coming of Moshiach, because then they will have the freedom and the peace of mind to study Torah and absorb its wisdom. Because at that time, when Moshiach comes, there will be no hunger and no wars, there will be no animosity and no jealousies, because all good things will be abundantly available, and all delicacies will be as abundant as the sand. And therefore, all effort, all the striving of human beings will be towards acquiring the knowledge of God. And at that time, Jews, of course, will be the teachers or the wise, because we are studied in the knowledge of God. And we will then grow or rise to know God to the extent that a human being is capable of knowing his Creator. As it says, and then the earth will be filled with the knowledge of God like water fills the oceans, covers the oceans. And all of these things, the fact that after Moshiach there will be no hunger, and that there will be no war or jealousy or animosity, these are not necessarily miracles. All of this is really within reach and within nature. There's no need for a miracle in order to put an end to hunger. That can happen very naturally. It doesn't take a miracle to put an end to war. That can happen naturally. All good things should be abundant, and delicacy should be available like sand. All of that is perfectly natural. All that is necessary is a little bit of goodness on the part of the human being, and then there's no need for anyone to go hungry, or for any wars to take place, or for any jealousies to exist. One thing that the Rambam doesn't mention is that there won't be any sickness after Mashiach comes, which seems to imply that there will be, because for people to never get sick would be a miracle. Now, there will come a time after Mashiach when people will stop getting sick. But then if they stop getting sick, they also stop dying. And that's a whole different era, a different period from the days of Mashiach. And that period is called the world to come, or the world of resurrection. The world to come is when all the laws of nature are changed, when God switches everything and the laws of nature are discontinued and people stop dying. But as long as people are dying, there'll probably be sickness in the world. So the Rambam can't say that in the days of Mashiach there will be no sickness. But along the same lines as hunger and war, there's a certain amount of sickness that isn't necessary and exists only because of man's indecency, man's inhumanity. Because if we were truly motivated by selfless devotion to the well-being of our fellow man, then medicine would probably be more advanced than it is today, and certainly more available to the average person in the world than it is today. So if medicine became more available, and the motivation behind research for cures and for solutions to medical problems was more selfless, then there would be more medical knowledge, and that medical knowledge would be more available, and so a lot of sickness that exists today would no longer exist, and without any miracles. So the role of Moshiach is very clear and very simple. Moshiach cannot be some hermit, some unknown, who is somehow mystically generating holiness into the world. Moshiach has to be a leader, a king. And in this role of leadership, he has to be a great scholar, and he has to be a tzaddik. And the scholarliness and piety have to rub off on his fellow Jews. He has to bring all Jews back to observing the mitzvahs. And then he has to fight God's battles, whatever that is. Whatever ungodliness is going on, he has to fight it. He has to combat it. Then he has to build the Beis HaMikdash in its proper place, which could become a bit of a tangle, because the proper place for the Beis HaMikdash is on the Temple Mount. which right now is occupied by a rather expensive building belonging to Muslims. So that may be a little sticky. But that's one of the things that he has to do, is build a temple in its proper place and then gather all Jews back to Israel. And then we will point to him and say, this is Moshiach, whether he admits it or not. In the meantime, the coming of Moshiach is not something we sit by and wait for passively, but rather we prepare the world and we prepare ourselves to become pure, so that the coming of Moshiach is not a miraculous event that upsets us and happens in spite of us, but rather, as the Rebbe says, the Alter Rebbe said that Moshiach's arrival will be announced in the papers, like any other piece of news, because Moshiach's arrival has to be without the disruption of our lives. We don't want Moshiach to come in spite of us. We want Moshiach to come because we are ready, because the time is right, because we are prepared. So the coming of Moshiach is not merely something to look forward to, something to give us hope for the future. It is literally an obligation, a very important part of our daily life, to know that everything we do, now that we're at the end of history, getting close to the deadline, which is the year 6000, and we are in the year 5746, getting on to the time when Mashiach has to come, then every mitzvah that we do is not only an improvement in our private lives, an improvement for ourselves and our family, for our immediate surroundings, but this additional mitzvah, whatever the mitzvah is, might be the final touch, or the few touches that the world needs in order to build up the reservoir of holiness that has accumulated over all these years, and bring it to the point where the world is ready for Mashiach. So as the Rebbe says, if we can cause Mashiach to come one moment sooner, then we will have saved the world one moment of anguish and of suffering. Because until Mashiach comes, nothing is quite right. The world is not quite balanced. And as long as the world is not quite balanced, everybody is going to have their little aches and pains and agonies and sufferings and worries and concerns. So if Mashiach comes a moment sooner, we save the world a moment of agony. Now, assuming that there are 4 billion people in the world, that's 4 billion moments of pain. In terms of our responsibility to our fellow Jew, there are 14 million Jews in the world. And there's no doubt that until Mashiach comes, that for the Jews, certainly, the world is out of balance. And every Jew has his pekel, his burden of tzaras. And if we bring Mashiach a moment sooner, that's 14 million moments less suffering for the Jewish people. That's a very long time. If you're going to take the example of Rabbi Akiva, he didn't just sit around waiting for Mashiach, hoping that he would come. He actually carried Bar Kokhba's armor. You have to do something to bring Mashiach. So if the Rebbe says that it's important for little girls to light candles, then we have to get little girls to light candles. And if the Rebbe says that it's important for Mashiach to come, it's important that every Jew has a letter in the Torah, then we should go out and see to it that every Jew has a letter in the Torah. If it's important that there be prayer in public schools or a moment of silence, then that's an important thing and we should work for it. On the subject of prayer in public schools, since it's very timely, there are many arguments and many fears and hesitations, particularly among Jews. And it's all, of course, based on or blamed on the Constitution. The statement that the government should not establish an official religion, or the concept of separation of church and state, is obviously a very fine thing and a necessary thing. The people who wrote this law were people who believed and studied the Bible, and yet felt that it's necessary to keep government separate from the church. The reason was because of what they saw happening or what they had experienced in the countries of their origin, where the church became, in many cases, more powerful than the government itself, and the church began dictating the laws of the land. Now, that's a very unacceptable thing, not only because it turns ugly, not only because it leads to crusades and inquisitions and forced conversions, but also because Torah says that the only kind of religious leadership that is acceptable and feasible is Moshiach. That's the only place and the only instance in which religion and politics can mix. Moshiach will be a king, and he will also be a tzaddik. But until Moshiach comes, no such leadership can possibly exist. And this joining or mating of religion and politics simply can't succeed. It turns ugly. Parenthetically, even in Israel, we can see how the attempt to legislate religion is having a horrible effect, because mixing religion and politics before the coming of Mashiach is doomed to failure. It's interesting, if you think about Jewish history and the names that come to mind, whom do we remember? Who stands out in Jewish history in a positive light? The average kid in school has heard of Rabbi Akiva. And who doesn't know Bar Kokhba? We can talk about the sage Hillel. Most people have heard of him. But who was the political leader of Jews at the time of Hillel? You have to be a historian to know that. Because who cares? Probably wasn't any good anyway. We haven't had a political leader since the destruction of the temple, because that's what exile means. Exile means that we can't survive politically. We have to function and survive on our virtue. The only time that that's going to be changed is when the Golus is over and Mashiach comes. And if that's true of the Jewish people, it's probably true of the whole world. As long as there is exile for the Jew, there can't be political leadership that is good. Although in the last couple of years, we've seen this strong desire on the part of many countries to find moral leadership, mixing politics and morality. And that's because we're so close to Mashiach that kind of mentality is already beginning to develop. We don't want powerful leaders, we want moral leaders. At any rate, this thing with separation of church and state, it's important and it's necessary to separate the state from a given particular church. But church does not mean belief in God. A church means a very specific and very parochial form of serving God, way of serving God. That's what a church is. When we say that there is to be a separation of church and state, we use the word church advisedly. We don't want any church becoming the political power, gaining political power in the United States. And that has nothing to do with God. Because if there were no churches in the world, we would still serve God. We would believe in God, we would trust in God, we would recognize our Creator just as well, if not better. So that the Constitution is not in any way suggesting that we separate God from state. It's saying that we need to separate church from state, and that's a whole different story. And that's why, without having to be much of a scholar, we understand how it is that soon after the Constitution was written, the government found it necessary and proper to print on all of its currency, on its coins, that we trust in God. And this didn't happen as a result of a moral majority. It was not their idea to put God's name on our coins. This happened way back when, and has been around for a long time. So as they were writing in the Constitution that we must separate church from state, they were at the same time printing God's name on the currency. And it's not a contradiction. And it wasn't an oversight or hypocrisy. Both are absolutely correct and necessary and positive. Separation of church and state is a good thing, and trust in God is an even better thing. And particularly in politics, it's a very important thing. So when people come along and say, we're very concerned because Reagan keeps mentioning God, there's nothing wrong with that. On the contrary, that's the best thing that has happened in a long time. That may be why we're not involved in a third world war, or why there hasn't yet been a nuclear confrontation. For a government to exist without God is a total disaster. And that's not what the Founding Fathers intended or envisioned. A government without God. That's what they were running away from. They came to America so that they could live a normal life under God and not have conflict. That's why they kept the church out of the state, because bringing church into the picture creates conflicts. Suddenly this one is saying that God has to be served this way, and the other is saying God has to be served the other way. So fine, keep the church out of it. But you can't keep God out, or we have no state at all. So for people to say we shouldn't open sessions of Congress with a prayer, that's ridiculous. That's dangerous. We wouldn't want a body of politicians who do not begin their day with a mention of God to make decisions affecting our lives without having a moral basis in their own lives. As a matter of fact, maybe they should mention God more often. On the other hand, we certainly don't want people saying that this is the way to serve God or telling us how we should serve God. But to know that there is a Creator, to know that the world is not a jungle, and that it doesn't exist by accident, that there is a sanctity to the world and to life because God created it with a purpose and He cares. To not have that is to not have a country at all. So there really needn't be any confusion between bringing God back into the picture and at the same time taking church out of the picture. And the only possible effect of doing this would be a positive one. If we could recognize God together, in this we're not different and not separated. If we could emphasize our dependency on God, in which we are the same, it's a universal thing, it has nothing to do with any particular church. If we recognize the Creator of the world and give Him His due credit, that would bring us together, not separate us. Very few things exist in this world that mankind has in common. This is one of those things. The fact that we are all God's creatures and therefore owe Him a debt. And how do we thank Him? How do we speak to Him? That's your own business. But that you ought to thank Him, this we share in common. This we must remember. This we must know. This we must repeat and remind ourselves every day, because if we forget what we owe God, then how are we ever going to remember what we owe each other? So all these people running around in a panic, afraid that their kids are going to have to mention the name of a particular god in the school. No damage has ever resulted from the fact that God's name is on our coins. And nobody's offended by it. Not the Jew, not the Christian, not the Muslim, not the Buddhist, not the Hindu. Nobody's offended by it. And should you find a group of people who are offended by God's name because they're atheists, well, there are communists in this world too. But that doesn't mean that America has to go along with communist policies or philosophies. Nobody's forcing anybody to believe in God. It's a free country, but it's a country based on God, just as it's based on democracy. And to say that we cannot preach democracy because some people don't believe in it is suicide, national suicide. It's ridiculous, and it's not part of being a democracy. Part of the democracy is that you teach democracy, you preach democracy, you respect democracy, and you don't preach or teach communism, even though you have to allow freedom of speech to those who wish to publicize or to propagandize for communism. Country is based on the principle that God created all people equal. To stop believing in God and to stop respecting God, to stop preaching about God, is to say that democracy is a failure. The president, for some reason, is on the warpath. He insists on having a verbal prayer, which does create a problem. What exactly are you going to say, and who's going to write the text? The Rebbe has been very firm on insisting that Jews must, out of obligation, out of Torah law, support a non-Jew who wants to express his awareness and his belief in God, because that's one of the commandments that all mankind is obligated to obey. But the Rebbe wants it done in a moment of silence. What will happen in this moment of silence? Parents will have to provide each child with material, with content, to think, to use during that moment of silence. So the kid is going to come home and say that the school has notified him that the school day, the beginning of each day, there will be a moment of silence in which he is to think about his life and about the world and so on. And the kid is going to ask his mother, what should I think? I don't know what to think. And the parents will tell him what to think, which is a very nice way of involving the parents, of getting the parents to think a little. So although it may be that certain people will tell their kids to worship an idol in that moment of silence, that's a subject we have to deal with in any case, whether you do it at school or you do it at home. That there is idolatry going on is a problem. The Rebbe uses the argument that in the time of the Holocaust, we know that there were many people who, because they believed in God, could not bring themselves to turn Jews over to Nazis. They had at least that amount of decency. It's better than nothing. And the problem with the fact that it's idolatrous even if it's at home or in the church or wherever it is, it's idolatrous. If we're going to teach people not to worship idols, that's a project in itself. But to tell children that God has no place in their public school, that's almost a communist position. To say that the government or the state is free of God, is separate from God, that's a very unholy position to take. There's another consideration, and that is that one way or another, it seems pretty clear that if it's not this year, then next year, next time around, sooner or later, someone will prevail and get the law passed that will permit prayer in public schools. That seems pretty clear. They say that 80% of the population wants it, beginning to look like 80% of the politicians want it. Sooner or later, there will be a prayer in public school. I would hate to think that should a prayer be introduced in the public schools, it will be in spite of the Jewish vote. We wouldn't ever want it to be said that non-Jews brought God back to the schools over the protests of the Jew. That would be a horrible thing. That would be a wrong position for the Jew to find himself in. And also, if we don't support a godly prayer or a godly position in terms of how children should relate to God, then the prayer that will finally be introduced will be a non-godly one. It will be the wrong one. It will be one that will again cause problems. This is one of the arguments. People are saying that if you bring back a prayer to public schools, we're going to have in America what's going on in Ireland. The problem with that argument is, are we saying that there is no way that religious people can get along? I mean, is that what it boils down to? That if you're going to be religious, you can't get along because look what's going on in Ireland? Is there no way that human beings can recognize God and serve God without becoming each other's enemy? It seems that the problem always comes about when you start talking about the way of serving God, not when you talk about God. If people come along and say, there's only one way to serve, that starts wars. But when people come along and say, there's only one God, that's good. That makes people better, not worse. Democracy is based on the assumption that people can overlook their petty differences and function based on what they have in common. Come together on common grounds, put aside those things that make us different and separate us, and then we can live together. Tolerate those things that make us different, but maintain our differences. Well, the same is true with religion. The ability to put aside our differences and function based on what we have in common, that should apply to religion as well. Put aside those things that separate people in religion and function and work on those parts of religion that bring people together. And what is that? What exists in this world that people can come together on? That's the Torah. The Torah, the same Torah that the Jew believes in, is the Torah that the Christian believes in, that the Muslim believes in. And the Torah addresses itself both to Jew and non-Jew. To the Jew, Torah gives 613 commandments, and to the non-Jew, to all human beings, Torah addresses 7 commandments. The prohibition against idolatry, not to worship idols, not to murder, not to be blasphemous, not to steal, not to commit sexual crimes, sexual sins, not to be cruel to animals, and to establish courts of law to enforce the first 6 commandments in every community. Those are the 7 commandments, and of course they have many details and sub-commandments and so on. But basically, these 7 commandments sum up human decency and morality. And this is what God addresses through Torah, through Moshe, at Mount Sinai, to all the people of the world. And the prophecy that talks about the coming of Moshiach states very clearly that in the end of days, all the nations of the world will flow to the Jewish people and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of God. Teach us his ways, and we will follow and go along his path." So our obligation to each other and our obligation to mankind in general is that the Torah become the basis on which all human beings build their faith and base their morality and their behavior, so that the world can become ready for the coming of Moshiach.